This podcast is brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International. To find out more, visit blackaby.org.
Well, welcome to the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast. So good to have you with us. My name is Sam. I'm your host, and here to help take your leadership to the next level. I'm joined, as always, by Dr. Richard Blackaby.
That's right, Sam. It's good to be with you.
Well, this Thanksgiving week here, and it's that time of year where we stop. We have to stop at least, and give thanks. And it feels like, perhaps for many, this year all you've done is stop. and you've had to reflect on, for a lot of people, what really matters in life. And here in the U.S., we do that every Thanksgiving. We at least stop for a day and give thanks for what we have. And so we want to talk about that today.
Yeah, and it's kind of sad. We're probably the most prosperous nation in human history, and yet we have to kind of schedule in a day to be grateful, to be thankful. Any people with as much as we have ought to be just super abounding in gratitude. But
well, you would think there would be lots of gratitude, but
not so much.
Yeah, that's not always the case, unfortunately.
Yeah, Sam, as you know, because I involved you in the process. This week was a little interesting for me. I've had a wedding ring. My original wedding ring I bought when I was dirt poor and a skinny college student. Eventually got too small.
Are you saying you're no longer a skinny college student?
Right, I'm not a college student anymore. So several years ago, now I'm 10 or 12 maybe now, I bought a newer, nicer ring, and it was always a little big for me, but I figured I'd grow into it. But as you know, I've lost about 30-some pounds, and it was getting really loose, and it's an expensive ring. It's probably paid more for it than I should have, but so just this week, I was going out to get my mail. And, it's just a series of unfortunate circumstances. After I thought to myself, I don't remember going down and getting the mail, so I'll just run down and get that. I get down there only to remember afterward that, I picked it up when I drove into the driveway earlier today. I didn't need to. This was a totally useless trip to the mailbox.
Well, you got a little exercise.
Yeah, but so I get down there, and as you know, my son Daniel lives across the street, and he keeps his dog Bilbo tied up out there where he can kind of run around the yard. And so he is always shameless. Bilbo, when he sees me, he starts begging me to come over and pet him and play with him. And so in a weak moment, I thought I'll cross the street and just take a minute and pet this dog. And so I get over there and I'm tossing him around and wrestling with him, and he's having a good time. And finally I'm done. I go back to my house, sit down at my desk, getting back to work. All of a sudden I realize I don't have my ring on anymore. My ring is gone. And so of course you try to retrace your steps. And my first thought is, well, it must have fallen off when I was wrestling with Bilbo. And so I hurry back across the street, and I'm digging around. Of course, Bilbo relieves himself all over the yard there, and so I'm digging around through some kind of unpleasant items. I can't find it anywhere, and I'm looking and looking and looking, and I just feel sick. And you know those frustrating things where it's just completely unnecessary. It's not like I was robbed, or it's not. I just going
those are the worst.
Going to the mailbox only to remember I didn't need to go to the mailbox, and then wrestling with a dog. Like if I lose an expensive wedding ring because I played with a dog for a minute, and so I look and look and look and look, and I go ring the doorbell and recruit my son Daniel to come out and help me to look, and we cannot find it. We're looking everywhere. I come back out that night. I think, there's some, shiny objects in this ring. At night, maybe if I shine a flashlight on it, maybe it'll stand out in the grass where I'll see a sparkle or something. And so here I am at night walking through my son's yard with a flashlight, looking everywhere. Can't find it. The next day, you and I actually did a podcast together, and then I recruit you as you're driving me back to my house. And you're on your hands and knees like a good son-in-law, wading through all kinds of unpleasant debris, trying to find. We can't find it. I thought surely your young eyes would see what I couldn't see, but
problem is it's quite a thick grass.
Yeah, it was thick, and it just so easy for a ring like that to just kind of nestle down underneath and be lost. And so that afternoon, I decide to go get to pull out a rake, and now I go back and I'm raking all over his yard, and I'm ever widening circle. I know where I was petting him. He came right to the edge of his leash, and so I know I can see right where we were fighting, and so I just kind of go out from there, and I can't find it, and I'm about to just give up and think, I need to start calling every other place I was that day and hope maybe it was found. I ran by Walmart. It's like, well, maybe someone turned in this expensive wedding ring in the Walmart parking lot, but not likely.
Oh, wishful thinking.
And so I'm about to just pack up and go back across the street, and I think, I just hate quitting. I hate giving up. And so it's like, okay, I'm going to go just a little further. Now this is, I don't know how I could possibly have gotten this far, but I will. And I start raking, and I hear a clunk. And on that metal rake, I look down, and there it is. And I'll tell you what, it reminds me of Jesus' parables in Luke 15 about searching for a lost coin and so on.
Yeah.
And the thrill of finding something that was lost. And because I called you, I called my daughter, I called everybody that had been praying that I find my ring. And it's, in the big scheme of things, it wasn't like I had a near relative fighting for their life from COVID or, that had lost a job. I mean, it's just a ring. But that joy and thanksgiving of realizing, because I'd already called my insurance company to see if they would, cover a lost ring out of my own just carelessness and all the stuff that I would have to go through and the expense. And then suddenly there it is, right there. And just sometimes it's even, I find often Thanksgiving, it really is about even some of the smaller things. It's just when you stop and you realize just over the course of the day, how many times life is good and God is good, and then you realize why would I get so excited about this? But like, I've got good health right now. I've got a wonderful family. I've got all kinds of things to be grateful for.
Yeah.
Why am I not just kind of going throughout the day, just pinching myself and saying, despite all the bad stuff that's out there, and there certainly is, there's just so much I just should be overflowing with gratitude toward.
Yeah. Well, and it's one of those things where we take for granted the stuff that we don't have and the stuff that we do have. And you mentioned before we went live just about giving thanks for even the things that you don't have.
Yeah.
And I really like that. Can you maybe just unpack that a little bit? Like, why would you give thanks for? Well, maybe before we do that, why don't we? I think you brought a passage to look at.
Yeah, we may stick the Bible in there for a second.
Yeah, why not? Let's do that.
There's a number of passages that are great in terms of Thanksgiving, but one that's kind of jumped out to me for this podcast was Philippians 4, verses 6 and 7. It says, "Don't worry about anything, but in everything." And it's interesting to have anything and everything thrown in there. It's pretty comprehensive. So it's saying there's nothing that you should be worrying about, and everything you should be praying and having petition with thanksgiving. Present your request to God, and the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. And so certainly in 2020, there's been lots of anxiety-inducing issues to take place.
Sure.
And you certainly couldn't be surprised if at some point during this year you felt a little anxious, worried, at least concerned. Certainly COVID is a life-threatening illness. It's highly contagious. There's been all kinds of economic challenges, quarantines, and shortages in stores of certain items, canceled travel, just so many things. Wearing a mask, just to go run into the store for something. So much disruption and so much uncertainty, not to say anything about all the racial unrest, the political polarization. There's lots of things to be anxious about. And Paul, when he writes this to the Philippians and he says, but don't worry about anything, but in everything, just pray, basically, with thanksgiving. And it's interesting, you might ask yourself, well, why pray with thanksgiving? Like, you haven't gotten your request yet. You just, pray, and then when you get the answer, maybe have thanksgiving. But why would you pray with thanksgiving? And I thought about that for a moment. I thought, for one, the very fact that you can pray, the very fact that you can talk to God, before you even settle the matter of whether he answers or not. When there's a need, my mother, as you know, right now has a lot of stress on her. She's kind of managing their household, and she's feels overwhelmed with a lot of the issues of maintaining independent living and so on. And so I'm kind of first on her speed dial, and she can get kind of frustrated if I'm in a meeting or on a plane or something and don't answer when she calls. And she may call 3 or 4 times, desperate to hear my voice and to be able to talk to me about what concerns her. And there's just something about knowing that when you do face a problem, there's someone you can call. I think with COVID, that isolation, I think for some people, it really it revealed to them that when they were going through a crisis or they were worried about something, they really might have to rack their brain to think, who could I call that would actually care, that would actually drop what they were doing and maybe even endanger their life by facing COVID-19 and coming to help me. And I think it was a shock to some people, an eye-opener, to realize, who do I have in my life who really cares about me, who checks on me, who says, hey, I haven't seen you for a while. You've been holed up in your house. Do you need anything? Can I bring you something? And so Paul says, but do you understand that no matter what you're facing, you can always go to God, the creator of the universe, the most powerful person in existence. And he's always willing to take your calls and always willing to hear what you're burdened about. And so just the fact you can always go to him, you ought to be grateful just to start before you've even given him your request. But also you just know that when you do present a need to him, he's going to do what's best. He may have a better solution than what you're asking him to do. He may not always give you what you want, but he's going to give you what's best, and he will respond. And so you might as well just be grateful, because biblically, if God listens to your request, if he hears you, then he's going to do something. He's going to respond. And so Paul just says, don't be anxious. Just go to God. Just have a lifestyle of prayer, that the moment you face something that could be concerning, start talking to God about it. And as you talk to God, you can't help but be grateful that, number one, you can talk to him, and number two, he's going to do something about it. And I was thinking, when he writes to the Philippians, of course, this is the city where he was falsely accused, unjustly arrested, beaten, thrown in jail. And you would think he'd have been angry. You think he'd be shouting, I want my lawyer. I get my one phone call.
Do you have any idea who I am?
Instead, he and Silas are singing hymns at midnight, not worrying, not anxious. Obviously, they're in pain. They're suffering physically, and yet they still have joy. And so you can just imagine, maybe that Philippian jailer is in the church, hearing this letter being read out loud from Paul, and he can't help but remember and say, well, yeah, that sounds like Paul. When he was at his lowest point, he's still singing and happy, and now he's writing to us and telling us, now don't be anxious, don't be worried, just be grateful.
Well, it's interesting how so often in Scripture there's the negative to avoid, but then there's a positive to implement or to do. And so in this case, it seems that when you are thankful, it's sort of the antidote to anxiety.
Yeah.
And so if you're giving thanks, if you're having to go down your checklist and say, well, so what in my life can I be thankful for? it's very hard then to be anxious for all the rest of it.
Right.
And so I think Paul knew that when he was writing to the Philippians, and it's just such a great reminder as we are in the week of Thanksgiving to know that actually, that's a great antidote to all the anxiety of the year even.
Yeah, and I think you're right, Sam. I think so much of anxiety comes down to what you're focusing on. And certainly there are lots of issues right now that if you chose to focus on would cause anxiety. And there are troublesome issues going on in the nation right now and in the economy. But at least once a year, for a Christian, I think it should be a daily experience, but at least once a year, stop and say, I choose not to focus on those things right now, because obviously when you're praying, then you've just turned your focus to God, and you focused your attention on the goodness of God, God's love for you, his compassion for you. So instead of looking at the problems in this moment, now you're looking at God, and you can't help but shift in your emotions when you start focusing on him.
Well, and I think that's why Paul said, to pray with thanksgiving, because I think there is a type of prayer where we pray, but it's just a sort of
could be woe is me prayer.
That and just all the issues, and you can just sort of go down your laundry list of problems to God. Now, it's good to take that to God, but sometimes when you pray, it's more about you than it is even about God. And so I think Paul's even, pray, but here's how, when you do pray, be sure you're giving thanks, and that helps shift your focus.
Yeah, that's a certain quality and focus of prayer that I think if you get to there, you're going to realize. Now, and again, it doesn't mean that some of those negative things aren't a reality. It just means that they're just part of the reality. And if you just focus on the negative aspect of reality, it's going to harm you emotionally as well.
Richard and Daniel Blackaby will be at the Billy Graham Training Center at the Cove on May 17th through 19th, 2021. The title of this event is On the Move, How God Increases Your Spiritual Influence. It was originally scheduled to be held this year, but due to COVID-19 has been rescheduled. You can find out more and register at thecove.org. Links will also be in the show notes.
Yeah, so as you were saying, there's at least two things. I mean, there's lots of things to be thankful for, but one is obviously be thankful for what you have. And sometimes we just don't appreciate what we have until we don't have it anymore. And so to have your health, I don't know how many times you get out of bed in the morning and say, God, thank you that I got out of bed and I didn't even have a lot of aches and pains. And I was able, I know it was kind of hard going on that 5K run this morning, but thank you that I can do it. Thank you that I maybe live in a neighborhood where I can run around my neighborhood, or thank you that I can afford to buy that good pair of expensive running shoes so I don't blow out my knees. My mother and dad, they're both in their 80s now, and they're definitely declining and mentally declining, and they're getting to be high needs at this stage of their life. And sometimes when I've gotten the fourth, fifth phone call from my mother, distraught, needing to talk to her oldest son about something, it can kind of wear you down sometimes. Like, oh, there's that, just sitting down to have dinner with my wife, and there's my mother calling again. There's a part of you that can just kind of take a deep breath and say that my mother's wearing me out. But then it dawns on me, the other day I was kind of doing that. I was just sitting down to eat, the phone rings, and Mom, sometimes she'll get frantic and call you 3 or 4 times, and then when you do answer, then she forgets why she called, and so it's just drive you crazy. But but then as I looked at my wife, I realized that her parents died about 30 years ago. And I realized, I've, for all the frustrating times that my parents can cause me, I've had them for 30 more years than my wife has had her parents, and we've made lots of memories, had lots of laughs, lots of love, and the fact that I've got the reason that they're now so needy is that they've lived into their 80s. They've lived a long time. I've had them. Here I am at my age, my ripe old age. I still have both of my parents. Yeah. They live 2 blocks away. I can go see them anytime I want to. And so, if you focus on, oh, is that my mother calling again? I haven't even had time to like have my morning coffee, and already my mom's calling, needing to talk to me about stuff. But then you think, but one day, and probably not all that long from now, I won't be getting those calls anymore. And when all of a sudden I know a day is going to come where I'm going to think to myself, I would just love to talk to my mother. I just would love to have the phone ring and it be my mom, and it's never ever going to happen again. And so, you can look at the same thing and say, well, when I've got certain things, I don't necessarily appreciate the fact that my mom does call, that she's still alive at this stage of my life. And then later, when you don't have that anymore, then you suddenly think, wow, I was so fortunate, and half the time it frustrated me instead of made me thankful. And I've got to stop and just ask myself, what in my life do I have right now that I haven't really appreciated like I should? And there's so many things, even in a nation like we're in right now that has a lot of problems, a lot of turmoil, a lot of things I wish were different.
Sure.
But at the same time, you and I both have traveled internationally, and you don't have to go to all that many countries before you start to think, boy, it's good to get back to the good old USA.
Yeah, you realize that despite all the issues, it could certainly be significantly worse based on, many of the countries that you and I have been to.
I remember just driving through a large city in Africa, and I literally thought at least a dozen times that we were about to crash. The traffic was so horrible, cars swerving into our lane. I mean, I just literally just braced, and I'm not all that timid of a driver or rider, No,
I'd say there's zero timidity in your driving.
But I'll tell you what, and I wasn't even driving. I was in the back seat, and I was just bracing at least a dozen times. I literally held on to the front of the car seat in front of me, preparing for impact. I was sure it was very stressful. We get there, there's swarms of people trying to grab your luggage from you so that you will pay them $20 for them to carry it 5 feet for you. You get in to check in, and you're getting asked for bribes from all these bureaucrats who take a look at your suitcase and then are asking you for, don't you have something for me? And all the different lines that you have to wait in, and sometimes they just want to kind of let you know that they're in charge, and you have to do what they say. And at a certain point, I love the people in those countries. I love the Christians, the churches, but there are times where you're just glad to be back home, and you realize, you'll, if you've been out of the country for a week or so, as soon as you land, you're starting to hear news and how people are upset about this or that, and sometimes you think, well, I've just been somewhere where it's a lot worse, and I'm not happy about some things in this country, but there's still a lot of good there, and I could be worse, and I need to be grateful even for it's not all bad, it's not all good. But if you have an attitude of looking for the good, you don't have to look hard to find it. And there's an interesting study that was done. There's been several studies done. There's an interesting one. It was called the Nun Study. And a guy looked at a large group of nuns, and they all were required, or they journaled throughout their life. And so he got all their journals, and so he would go back and read back when they were like in their 20s and 30s, and now they're 80s, 90s, even some over 100. And but if he went back and read when they were in their 20s and 30s, and he keeps finding them expressing gratitude and seeing the positive. He tabulated all that. Okay, these people, even in their 20s, already had a grateful spirit, were thankful for what they had, even if they didn't have very much. A lot of these were nuns who had kind of renounced worldly goods. They didn't have a lot of possessions, and yet they were grateful for what they did have. That he found that those who typically were characterized by gratitude lived on average about 7 years longer than those who weren't grateful. And one of his conclusions was literally gratitude will add years to your life. And lots of similar studies that show just positive effects of gratitude. And I think part of that is because you just stop being anxious. Being anxious takes a physical toll, an emotional toll on your body. And so I thought that was interesting that literally just being grateful has physical positive effects. But, maybe this is the last thing to say on that is that also be grateful for what you don't have. We of course, we that's not a typical thing that we do where God, I'm so glad I don't have this or don't have that. Certainly
glad I don't have that new car.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I would hate to have that.
Spared me from that payment.
I hate that smell of fresh new leather. Let's not go there.
I don't think that's what you mean.
Yeah, but when you don't have COVID, I've heard it's from people who have it that it's a terrible experience. Even if you recover from it fairly quickly, it still can be an awful thing. I remember a couple years ago having a lot of symptoms that looked like I might have colon cancer, and when you go and get all tested, and the doctor comes in and says, "Well, you don't have cancer." I'll tell you what. Sometimes I've never been so grateful for what I didn't have. And yet, day by day, you get up and go into your day, and you never stop to think, "Well, I don't have a cold, don't have the flu, don't have COVID, don't have cancer." I don't have unemployment right now. And if you've ever been anywhere where even utilities were in question, okay, we've got rolling power outages where for several hours a day you won't have electricity, or the water's been shut off for a couple of days because there's another water line break, and there's so many things that you take for granted that you turn a tap and there's water, you flip a switch and there's power, and then one day you don't have it, and you realize, wow, all this stuff that, these problems I didn't have, I never stopped just to be grateful for some simple things that weren't taken away from me that I had or that I don't have. And so maybe just the last two things to say with that, just wanting just to reflect a bit on just this season. One is just take the long view. And that is sometimes there are problems, and you may not like how the election turned out, for instance, but elections get redone every 4 years. And your life's not over because your candidate maybe didn't win. Take the longer view of life than the immediate. Realize that as a Christian, God works things out. And ultimately, as Christians, we have heaven waiting for us. The best is yet to come. So it only gets better for us in the long term. Sometimes we get so wrapped up in today that if we just kind of backed up a little bit and looked at the trajectory of our life and where God's taking us, we'd realize, wow, there's some setbacks, there's some disappointments and pain and suffering, but in the long run, we really have got it good as a Christian, and as a child of the King, we have a lot to look forward to. And so lastly, maybe just to say, I just would encourage all of our listeners, take time at some point during this season to actually just get out a piece of paper and just take a moment. It's there's actually been scientific studies that demonstrate if you will just take a moment to just write down things that you are grateful for, that where God has blessed you, where there are some reservoirs of joy in your life. Certainly your daughter, Sam, is one of those. I love it when Carrie, your wife, will text me a little video of my granddaughter saying something. She was saying Papa the other day, and on an airplane, and I'll tell you what, I've watched that about 1 million times.
Put that on repeat.
But I can have this really stressful day, and I'm trying to prepare all these things, and we've got these bills to pay, and this problem and that problem. And then all of a sudden you get a little video of your granddaughter saying, your name and who you are, and you realize, wow, God, you've been so good to me, and I don't deserve so much of what you've done or any of what you've done. And so take a moment and just use Thanksgiving for what it's for. It's not meant just to see how much turkey you can stuff into your mouth. It's about being grateful and being thankful. And don't let this week go by without making a list. And if you'll take time to just keep listing all the good things that are a part of your life, you may find that one page is not adequate for all that you want to write down. And I'll tell you what, not only will it honor God for you to identify those things, but it'll do you good as well to realize, even with a year as crazy as 2020, you still can fill up a page with things to be grateful to God for.
Well, I think that's a great place to end it, and we hope you all have a wonderful Thanksgiving. It's maybe not the Thanksgiving that you were expecting or that it was in years past, but there's still much to be thankful for.
Yeah.
And don't just be thankful, but express that thanks, whether it's writing it down, telling your family, your friends, and especially giving thanks to God. So until next time.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, it really makes a difference if you leave a review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. We always love hearing from our listeners, so email us at podcast@blackaby.org.